Every year, millions of tourists visit Britain's magnificent castles. They admire the architecture, take photos in the courtyards, and learn sanitized histories about medieval knights and royal pageantry. The tour guides talk about feasts, tournaments, and grand ceremonies. What they don't tell you is that many of these castles were sites of horrific violence, brutal executions, starvation sieges, and acts of cruelty that would make horror films seem tame. Some have reputations for being cursed, plagued by tragedies that span centuries. Others are simply soaked in so much blood that the stones themselves seem to remember. Today, we're exploring 5 of Britain's most cursed castles. Places where the dark history is far more interesting than anything on the official tour. These aren't ghost stories or legends. These are documented historical events that reveal just how brutal medieval and early modern Britain really was. Let's get into it. The Tower of London is Britain's most famous castle, and for good reason. This fortress on the Thames has served as a royal palace, an armory, a treasury, and most famously a prison and execution site. But the sheer scale of death and suffering within its walls is staggering. Over 900 years, the tower witnessed countless executions, murders, and tortures. Let's start with some of the most famous deaths. Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's second wife, was beheaded here in 1536 on fabricated charges of adultery and treason. She was taken to Tower Green and executed with a sword by a specialist executioner brought from France. Before her death, she allegedly joked nervously about her little neck. She was 35 years old. Catherine Howard, Henry's fifth wife, was also executed at the Tower in 1542, again on charges of adultery. She was around 19 years old. The night before her execution, she practiced laying her head on the block, wanting to die with dignity. Lady Jane Grey, the 9 Days Queen, was executed in 1554 at age 16 or 17. She was a pawn in political machinations and paid with her life. Eyewitnesses describe how she was blindfolded and couldn't find the execution block, fumbling for it while asking, "What shall I do? Where is it?" before finally being guided to place her head down. But these famous executions are just the tip of the iceberg. The tower was also the site of torture. In the infamous dungeons, the rack, the scavenger's daughter, and other devices were used to extract confessions. Guy Fawkes was tortured here after the gunpowder plot. His signature before and after torture shows how broken he became, from steady handwriting to barely legible scrawl. The princes in the tower, 12-year-old Edward V and his younger brother Richard, disappeared in 1483 while imprisoned here. Their uncle, Richard III, was suspected of having them murdered. In 1674, workers found a wooden box containing 2 small skeletons buried beneath a staircase. Were these the princes? Probably. It remains one of British history's most infamous mysteries. Then there's the sheer number of lesser-known victims, political prisoners who died of disease, cold, or starvation in the dungeons, prisoners who went mad in solitary confinement, common criminals executed on Tower Hill just outside the walls. The phrase "sent to the tower" was essentially a death sentence. Few left alive. Those who did were often broken physically and mentally. The tower wasn't just a prison. It was a place where the crown demonstrated absolute power through calculated cruelty. Today's tourists take selfies on Tower Green, where Anne Boleyn died. They look at the crown jewels and admire the architecture. The tour guides mention the executions, but in sanitized ways that don't convey the terror these walls represented. This was Britain's Bastille, its state prison where enemies of the crown were broken, tortured, and killed. The tower's curse? Perhaps it's simply the weight of all that suffering. Or perhaps it's the reminder that absolute power, even in civilized Britain, led to atrocities we'd rather not dwell on. Bury Pomeroy Castle in Devon doesn't have the fame of the Tower of London, but locals consider it one of Britain's most haunted locations. The ruins of this 14th century castle hide dark secrets that go beyond typical medieval violence. The castle's most famous legend involves 2 sisters, Margaret and Eleanor Pomeroy. According to the story, both loved the same man. Margaret, consumed by jealousy, imprisoned her sister Eleanor in the dungeons beneath the castle and left her to starve to death. Eleanor's ghost, the White Lady, is said to haunt the dungeons, appearing to visitors as a warning of impending doom. Is this story true? Probably not in its romantic form, but like many legends, it likely has roots in real events. Medieval castles were sites of family betrayals, inheritance disputes, and violence between relatives. Women were often pawns or victims in these power struggles. The story of the Pomeroy sisters probably reflects real violence, even if the specific details are embellished. What we do know for certain is that Berry Pomeroy saw its share of real horrors. During the English Civil War, the castle changed hands between royalists and parliamentarians. These sieges were brutal affairs. Civilians trapped inside castles during sieges faced starvation, disease, and violence. When castles fell, the victors often showed no mercy. The castle's dungeons were real, and they were used. Medieval dungeons weren't the theatrical spaces we see in films. They were often cramped, lightless spaces where prisoners were kept in horrific conditions. Death from disease, cold, and malnutrition was common. Some dungeons were oubliettes, literally forgotten places, where prisoners were dropped through holes and left to die. Berry Pomeroy's ruins also tell a story of decline and abandonment. After a fire in the late 17th century, the castle was never rebuilt. It was left to decay, creating the atmospheric ruins that stand today. There's something deeply unsettling about abandoned castles. They're monuments to failed power, to families that died out or fell from grace. The curse of Berry Pomeroy might be less about supernatural forces and more about the accumulated suffering of everyone who lived, was imprisoned, and died within its walls across centuries of violence. Leap Castle in County Offaly, Ireland, has a reputation as one of the most haunted castles in the world. Built by the O'Carroll clan in the 15th century, it was the site of some of the most brutal family violence in Irish history. The O'Carrolls were a powerful but violent family. The castle's most infamous room is the Bloody Chapel, where one of the darkest events in the castle's history occurred. During a family gathering, one brother, a priest, was saying mass in the chapel. Another brother, in a dispute over inheritance and power, drew his sword and murdered the priest in front of the altar. In the middle of the religious ceremony, family members watching did nothing to stop it. This wasn't an isolated incident. The O'Carrolls were notorious for internal violence. Brothers killed brothers, fathers murdered sons. The family dynamics were so toxic that they became legendary even in medieval Ireland, where family violence was depressingly common. But Leap Castle's darkest secret was discovered in the 19th century during renovation work. Workers found an oubliette, a dungeon designed for people to be thrown into and forgotten, behind a wall. When they opened it, they found it filled with human remains. Skeletons, some still with flesh on them, were piled several feet deep. There were so many bodies they couldn't count them all. These weren't casualties of battle or victims of disease. These were people, prisoners, rivals, perhaps even family members who had been thrown into this pit and left to die slowly of starvation and injury from the fall. The chamber was designed with spikes at the bottom to ensure those thrown in would be impaled. It was a murder pit, used for decades or even centuries. The discovery shocked even the hardened workers who found it. The sheer number of bodies, the cruelty of the design, and the fact that this chamber had been deliberately built into the castle revealed a level of systematic brutality that goes beyond typical medieval violence. Leap Castle also saw violence during various Irish conflicts, including the Cromwellian conquest of Ireland and later rebellions. Each conflict added to the castle's death toll. Today, Leap Castle is privately owned and occasionally opened for tours. Visitors report strange occurrences, cold spots, feelings of being watched, unexplained sounds. Ghost hunters consider it a prime location, but the real horror isn't supernatural. It's the documented history of what happened within these walls. Chillingham Castle in Northumberland has earned a reputation as Britain's most haunted castle. It's also home to some of the most horrific documented torture and execution in British history. Chillingham was on the border between England and Scotland, a region that saw centuries of brutal warfare, border conflicts, raids, and reprisals created a culture of violence that makes Game of Thrones look restrained. Both sides committed atrocities. Both sides remembered every grievance. Violence bred more violence in an endless cycle. Chillingham's most infamous feature is its torture chamber, which remained in active use until the mid-18th century. The castle employed a professional torturer named John Sage, who served from around 1685 until his death in the 1720s. Sage was enthusiastic about his work, perhaps too enthusiastic. The chamber contains various torture devices, many of which Sage reportedly invented or improved himself. The rack, devices for crushing bones, implements for burning, tools for mutilation. Sage had an extensive collection. Historical records suggest he tortured over 50 people per week during periods of intense border conflict. Over his decades of service, the number of victims runs into the thousands. Sage's specialty was keeping victims alive as long as possible during torture. The point wasn't just punishment, it was terror. Prisoners would be displayed after torture as warnings. Some were left in cages to die slowly. Others were executed in public as spectacles. The castle's dungeon, separate from the torture chamber, was equally grim. Prisoners were kept in horrific conditions. Disease was rampant. Many died before ever seeing trial or execution. The dungeon was essentially a death sentence. Either you'd die of disease and neglect, or you'd be taken to Sage's chamber. Chillingham also houses the Blue Boy, one of its most famous hauntings. Legend tells of a boy in blue clothing whose bones were found walled up in a passage during renovations, suggesting he was bricked in alive. While the story's details may be embellished, finding skeletons walled up in castles wasn't uncommon. People were sometimes imprisoned in tiny spaces and left to die, a form of execution that left no visible marks. The castle remained inhabited by the same family for centuries, but by the early 20th century it had fallen into severe disrepair. It was restored in the 1980s and is now open for tours and even overnight stays. Many visitors report disturbing experiences, sounds of screaming, apparitions, feelings of intense dread in certain rooms. But the documented history is disturbing enough without supernatural elements. Chillingham represents the brutal reality of border warfare, where torture and terror were tools of statecraft and social control. Glamis Castle in Scotland is famous as the childhood home of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. It's a grand, picturesque castle that looks like something from a fairy tale, but beneath its refined exterior lies some of the darkest family secrets in British aristocratic history. Glamis is associated with several disturbing legends, the most famous being the Monster of Glamis. According to the story, the Boleyn family had a hideously deformed child born in the 19th century. Rather than acknowledge this child, the family kept it hidden in a secret room in the castle for its entire life. Only the Earl, his heir, and the family lawyer knew of the child's existence. When each Earl died, the secret was passed to the next. Is this true? There's circumstantial evidence. There are accounts from the 1800s of workmen being sent away from certain parts of the castle during renovations. There are stories of servants hearing strange sounds. There's a blocked-off room that doesn't appear on the castle's floor plans. And there was indeed a child, Thomas Bowes Lyon, born in 1821, who officially died in infancy, but whose death certificate has never been found. The Monster of Glamis might have been this child, possibly suffering from severe disabilities, who was hidden away out of shame. A grim reminder that attitudes toward disability in aristocratic families were often cruel and based on preserving the family's reputation at any cost. Glamis is also infamous for the Grey Lady, said to be the ghost of Lady Janet Douglas. In the 16th century, Lady Janet was accused of witchcraft and plotting to poison King James V. The charges were almost certainly false, politically motivated attacks on the Douglas family. Lady Janet was burned at the stake in Edinburgh in 1537. She maintained her innocence throughout the ordeal. Her ghost is said to haunt the castle's chapel. The castle's history includes the usual medieval violence, battles, sieges, political murders. King Malcolm II of Scotland was supposedly murdered here in 1034. The room where he died, the King Malcolm's room, is said to be cursed, with bloodstains that can't be removed from the floor. But it's the more recent history, the hidden child, the family secrets, the lengths to which aristocratic families would go to maintain appearances, that makes Glamis particularly disturbing. Medieval violence we expect, but the Victorian-era cruelty of hiding a disabled family member for decades, allowing them to live and die in secret, reveals that brutal treatment didn't end with the medieval period. Glamis Castle is still inhabited by the Boleyn family and is open for public tours. The guides tell sanitized stories about royal connections and historical significance. They don't tend to dwell on the hidden rooms, the blocked-off spaces, or the family secrets that may still be buried within its walls. Britain's castles are magnificent monuments to architecture, engineering, and history. But they're also monuments to power, and power in medieval and early modern Britain meant the capacity for terrible violence. The Tower of London's executions, Bury Pomeroy's dungeons, Leap Castle's murder pit, Chillingham's torture chamber, Glamis's hidden secrets. These aren't legends or ghost stories. These are documented historical realities. They happened. People suffered and died in these places in ways that most tourists never hear about on the official tours. Why don't the tourist guides tell these stories? Partly because they're uncomfortable, partly because they don't fit the romantic medieval narrative we prefer, and partly because acknowledging the full scope of the violence might make people question whether these monuments to power should be celebrated quite as so uncritically. But these dark histories matter. They remind us that the good old days weren't good for most people. They show us what unchecked power looks like, and they force us to confront the uncomfortable truth that civilization and brutality often coexisted in the same stone walls. The next time you visit a British castle, look beyond the pretty courtyards and grand halls. Ask about the dungeons. Ask about who died there and how. The dark history is always more interesting than the official tour, and far more honest about what these castles really represented. If you enjoyed this darker look at British history, let me know in the comments what other historical locations you'd like me to explore. And if you learned something disturbing today, consider subscribing. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.